Welcome to another episode of Grace on Tap. Grace on Tap is a podcast dedicated to the history and the theology of the Lutheran Reformation, all over a nice cold beer. I'm Mike Yagley.
And I'm Evan Gaertner.
All right, so finally coming to the end of the story about the story of Frederick the Wise.
Yeah, so we've had, this will be the 8th episode that looks at events of the Reformation from the viewpoint of Frederick the Wise, kind of the political maneuverings that have to happen so that the Reformation, I think, is going to happen either way. I think that's the character of the Holy Spirit at work in the church, that there will always be these moments when we are driven by God to become a reforming people.
But there's always providence, and the placement of Luther in the kingdom or in the jurisdiction of Frederick the Wise was certainly providential, and we spent 7 episodes, I would say probably 4 or 5 episodes, just talking about how Frederick accumulated power, how somebody who was in essentially what was considered a backwater of Germany, the more premium part of Saxony had been stripped away.
A generation earlier, been labeled ducal Saxony. It was given the minerals and really the strength of economy. And so Frederick the Wise positions electoral Saxony through political power.
And he was able to pull it off and become the second most powerful man in Europe next to the emperor. And that's really saying something. And he was able to maneuver and use that position to outmaneuver both the emperor and the pope, which, again, certainly providential. So I think last time we left off, it was the end of the Diet of Worms.
And Luther had been kidnapped to Wartburg, and he's there. And there's maybe this hope that who knows how it's ever going to end up, but he's safe. Now, meanwhile, in Wittenberg, Karlstadt is aggressively trying to reform the church. You have the Invocavit Sermons when Luther comes back.
Those are coming.
Yeah. So the Reformation, is it going to lose its way while Luther is hidden?
It certainly came close. So during this time when Luther was at the Wartburg, Frederick was suppressing Luther's ability to publish, which I didn't know prior to this. And so Luther was writing, and very little was being published. And so it was basically radio silence. Into that vacuum steps several folks. One is Karlstadt in Wittenberg, but then you have Thomas Müntzer was he in Ingelheim, or was I forget where he was. And then you have the Zwickau prophets.
Nikolaus, Storch, Thomas Dressel, and Marcus Stubner.
And they all decided that they were getting special revelations from God. So you have Thomas Müntzer saying he's getting special revelations from God, and you have the Zwickau prophets saying they're getting special revelations.
And in Wittenberg, you've got Andreas Karlstadt, who had been kind of the head of the university, the provost, and really a big man on campus until Luther had started to really become influential. And with Luther gone, Karlstadt's going to make more influence. And then these internal conflicts kind of the Reformation groups. And then there's still the Pope. And there's still the Emperor.
Right. So Luther has all sorts of problems. He has problems with the Zwickau prophets, who are probably close to, I would say probably their teachings were sort of close to the modern Pentecostal movement.
The charismatic, the idea of that there's an internal revelation and that becomes more valued than the external word of God.
And then you have Thomas Müntzer, who is also saying that he's getting special revelations from God, but he's more of a cult leader, I guess is the way when I look at what he's teaching, it's sort of crazy what he's teaching.
Very apocalyptic. Interestingly, though, with communism, and in the early 1980s, Eastern Germany was really trying to figure out a way to kind of build up their own place in history. And they saw Luther and Thomas Müntzer as kind of forerunners of, say, maybe Engel and and Marx.
I was actually I came a breath away from the East German government went and put out currency with the picture of Thomas Müntzer on it, and it was all part of this, trying to build up the history of communism. And they looked at Thomas Müntzer as being one of the first communists, a proto-communist, and so they a revolutionary, advocating for violence if it gets in the way of doing the right thing type stuff, and they really liked him, and so they actually put him on their currency, and I came a breath away from buying some of that currency because I thought it was funny, but anyway. So that's what Frederick is up against. Is he's got these three forces, we'll say, the Zwickau prophets, Thomas Müntzer, which is he's gathering the peasants around him, hoping to start a revolution, and then you've got the Pope and the Emperor, and all of them are aligning against Frederick and Martin Luther.
And so Frederick's trying to wonder, could it be that these radical teachings really are from God? He knew the peasants were being abused by both the church and the princes, so it wouldn't be out of the question that God is angry with Germany and raising up, just like in the book of Judges, when the people were burdened by their enemies. God raised up judges to deliver the people from the forces of evil at work in the world. Could it be that God's at work and God is angry and bringing wrath through the instrument of the
peasants and
through
Thomas
the peasants and
Müntzer? And that really gives you an insight into Frederick's mindset, his psyche, where he was, I think, an incredibly humble man.
He doesn't want to be in opposition to God.
No, as I've gone through and learned more about Frederick, I've come to see him as probably one of my favorite people within the Reformation era, as a faithful man, trying a faithful as a lay person myself, as being somebody I can really look up to as a person who fulfilled his duties in the laity faithfully. And I just really like him and how he handled things.
He's an interesting bridge between the time of maybe the medieval and modern period. The modern period, I think, is going to be defined by placing man at the center of observing the world. And Frederick is always trying to observe the world through how God is going to see it.
Absolutely. So you have these three groups. You have the again, going back to, we have the Zwickau prophets who are claiming that basically a new Pentecostalism, which they're the sort of least of Frederick's problems. The next one is Thomas Müntzer, who's sort of raising up the peasants to revolt, which is the proto-communism.
And it's not just an economic thing. He thinks it's the end of the world apocalyptic view.
Absolutely.
And that it's time for people to rise up against worldly forces and bring a spiritual force to work in the world.
Right. And then you have the Pope and the Emperor who look at those Zwickau prophets and look at Thomas Müntzer and blame Frederick and Luther for all of this.
And that's still a modern critique online that social media influencer Catholics are making about Protestantism, is that, and this is something Erasmus was concerned about when we start looking at Erasmus in a future series on bondage of the will, is how dangerous division is.
Absolutely.
And this is the big blame. Division is your problem.
There's a real case to be made that schism, that being divided is problematic, but a serious review of what happened, I would place the burden on the Roman Catholic Church rather than on Luther.
And Luther would too. He'd say they've divided themselves away from the Word of God.
I absolutely agree. And actually, I maintain friendships with several priests, guys I grew up with, and they're sort of sympathetic to that view. They'll look at it like, I think I might have mentioned on the podcast, on an earlier podcast, was that a friend of mine went to the St. Peter's Basilica, and he was walking through it, and he said, it's not worth it. it wasn't worth it. And that was he's looking at a beautiful place. It wasn't worth it. And so he personally looked at the Catholics as being responsible for and the desire to build St. Peter's Basilica. He's not looking at what I think is
how the indulgences were necessary to pay for that and
exactly.
all that. So Zwickau profits are least of Frederick's problems. The Pope and the Emperor, they've seen enough. They're starting to turn up the heat. They want Frederick to hand over Luther for a trial in Rome. They want Frederick to bring unity back to the church by silencing all these forces, even if there would be forces created by the Word of God.
So they're looking for Frederick to enforce the Edict of Worms, which is to basically turn over Luther. And they're pulling all the strings that they can to try and get Frederick to do that.
They find one of Frederick's cousins, George, the Bishop Adolf of Mürzburg, and he is supposed to talk to his cousin and encourage Frederick to hand over Luther. Then Frederick's close friend, Cardinal Albrecht of Mainz, requested Frederick to enforce the edict. So family and forces are at work. And these aren't just casual requests. These are requests that, if ignored, could have spiritual, that's their claim, spiritual complications for Frederick, and then also economic complications.
And in the middle of all this, you have priests who are deciding to get married. Yeah, one of the first,
they're getting inspired.
They're getting inspired by Luther, and there's this growing anxiousness. There's growing chaos that's happening around Frederick, and he's just trying to keep things calm. And then right in the same time, December of 1521, you have Pope Leo X died,
and he's going to be replaced by the emperor's tutor, Pope Hadrian VI. So Leo, extravagant politician, raising a bunch of money, and not just wanting to be a part of every conversation in Europe, but wanting to look like he belongs with every conversation in Europe. Very extravagant. Hadrian, austere, a serious theologian. Leo had made a priority of accumulating power, and he saw Luther's teaching as an impediment to that goal of gaining power.
Where Hadrian is a little different animal, very different animal, almost the opposite. Hadrian, or Adrian, he's mostly interested in reforming the church. He agrees with Luther on that the church needed to be reformed. On the other hand, he really disagrees with Luther on all the other, everything else. Basically, Hadrian was he was sort of aligned with what eventually happened in the Council of Trent. Very conservative Catholic of that era, but a very faithful, we'll call it faithful conservative Catholic of that era. And so this was not going to be, it wasn't going to work for Luther having Adrian come in.
So there's going to be an imperial council that's going to meet in January of 1522. And Frederick and everyone else in the emperor is getting ready for this, including Duke George. He's in charge of ducal Saxony. He is arriving early to this council to make preparations to bring the Luther affair to an end.
Now, Duke George hates Luther.
He hates Luther. He wants his brother's electoral seat. He thinks that this could be a way that, and this is going to happen a generation later, after Luther dies, the battles of Augsburg and the Peace of Augsburg and the Peace of Leipzig. So 1550s, electoral Saxony is going to lose their electoral seat because of Luther. That's a possibility in the 1520s as well. It's not going to happen in this generation, but in 20 years from now, it's going to happen.
Absolutely. So this is all going on. Frederick finds himself in this corner, but he sees an opening in the third article of the council, which, as Frederick really was the one who pretty much wrote the articles of.
This is kind of like the standing rules for how the Reichstag is going to meet. What are their goals? What are their objectives? And in the third article, what did Frederick see? It
was so. What Frederick saw was there was a the third article was that the council was to handle disputes of Christian faith in the empire with other Christian estates and authorities. And the idea here was that, the original idea at least, it seems like Frederick wanted to keep the Pope at arm's length. But during this time, he was able to twist it to keep the Pope, keep everything, sort of just gum up everything with procedural stuff.
This language of to handle disputes, that sounds easy. Have some power and handle a dispute. But the language of with other Christian estates and authorities is going to add this layer of, well, did you talk to this person? Did you talk to that person? Has this group had a chance to say their thing? And the level of bureaucracy to make sure that everyone is involved.
Yeah, and Frederick was a master at creating bureaucratic entanglements.
The committee slowdown.
He was just so good. And so he's working through this. In the book,
the biography of Frederick the Wise that we've been using kind of as backbone for these 8 episodes.
There's a great sentence in there. It says, Frederick pretended to defer to church superiors, yet those church superiors did Frederick's will. So this is, Frederick had his own personal church superiors in electoral Saxony, and he was like, I don't know, I just refer to these guys. But they all knew what Frederick wanted was to keep Luther safe. And so it was sort of like,
he's going to keep Luther safe, but he's also going to be a little insulated. And that's part of the magic. So Frederick's representative to the council was deeply concerned by where this council could end up going. And so he pleaded with Frederick to attend in person. Frederick refused to go to the imperial council, the Reichstag. He provided an answer that he wasn't a theologian, and we should defer to the local church authorities on all these theological questions. So his answer was that the issues were outside his jurisdiction. The council hated that. They couldn't refute it, but it reminded the council that other people need to get involved. So the committee slowdowns at work.
It was just, everything became a hairball. Everything was just all twisted together, and you just couldn't untangle it, and Frederick was the guy who wove it all together to begin with. He's a master at that.
So the Reichstag, they finally meet in March of 1522. Immediately following the council, there wasn't much to do. The Reichstag was closed only 5 weeks later without comments on Luther or any of the official documents.
So, but within the, we'll say the informal discussions that happened, it was all about Luther. It was all about Luther. Immediately after the Reichstag ended, the council reconvened.
So the imperial council, kind of the executive team.
Yeah.
They convened. Everyone got together in the big assembly of the Reichstag. Nothing got decided.
Partly because Frederick was successful at making things too complicated. And so then they broke off and had the council, the top leadership got together, and they said, well, maybe we can work out something, just us, a smaller group.
And one of the reasons the council decided to keep talking about it is that Luther, even though Frederick wanted Luther to publish less, Luther was always going to publish more.
Yeah.
And Luther actually published a tract during this time period calling the members of the council tyrants.
So Frederick, again, left it to his representatives to manage the situation, and they claimed that Frederick was often displeased with Luther's writings, which, this actually worked. Again, Frederick was able to use this to his own advantage. He said, hey, listen, he's calling me a tyrant. Mm-hmm. I'm here. I'm in charge. He's calling me a tyrant too. And so he's saying, I'm often displeased with what Luther writes. But then Frederick's representatives also pointed out that Luther alone was able to bring order back to Wittenberg with the Invocavit Sermons. After the Zwickau prophets, and I think we might have skipped over this.
After the Zwickau prophets and Karlstadt, they had created this unrest in Wittenberg. And Luther comes back. He preaches the Invocavit Sermons, a series of 8 sermons to kind of talk about the process of introducing the gospel and telling the people of Wittenberg, you guys were excited, but you were wrongly motivated.
And so, Frederick says, hey, listen, if you want peace, Luther's probably the best guy to keep around to have peace in the empire. Let's take
a beer break before we talk about the execution of 2 monks.
Okay. Today's beer is from Cadillac Straits Brewing Company in Madison Heights, Michigan. It's the Rural Bavaria Hefeweizen.
And we've had a chance to be drinking this beer while we're recording, and it's strong flavor like most Hefeweizens of banana, cloves, incredibly sweet.
It is very sweet. It's a very sweet beer. I'm sure, I was telling Evan before we started, was that I think my wife Maria would absolutely love this beer. She likes this sort of a sweeter sort of beer. Not super sweet, but she loves a sweeter Hefeweizen, and I think this would be a favorite for her.
So thank you, Dave Bainey, for sharing the beer as a part of October Church Worker Appreciation Month, and I've been glad to share it with you, Mike. So Cadillac Straits Brewing Company, Madison Heights, thank you very much.
Cheers. Okay.
So the Edict of Worms declares that Luther and all those who assist him in advancing the Reformation are outlaws in the Holy Roman Emperor, and that people have permission to execute them without trial.
And about this time, on July 1st, there was the first executions in the name of the Edict of Worms. A couple of Augustinian monks who agreed with Luther were executed by the emperor's aunt, Marguerite, she was the regent of the Netherlands.
And so the Reformation is not happening just in Wittenberg. It's expanding out into the Netherlands. It's going to be expanding out to England, and there are consequences.
Yeah, and that's going to be an ongoing thing. And if you read Luther, he starts referencing the martyrs of this era in his writings, and he'll talk about it a lot of different ways. But you have to realize, when Luther is talking, if you ever read Luther, that he is given to hyperbole, but this is not hyperbole that he's talking when he starts talking about the suffering. It's
personal.
Yeah,
it's real.
These are people he knows who are being executed.
This isn't just a paper Reformation. Real lives are being affected.
Yeah.
Also, during Frederick's time at the council, at the Imperial Council, he has to hear a rant from his cousin, Duke George, regarding Luther's disrespectful response to a letter from King Henry VIII of England. So King Henry VIII is later going to be a part of a Reformation in England so that he can marry Anne Boleyn, annul his marriage to Catherine, and start the Church of England. But before he does that, he is given, like a rose or something like that?
The Golden Rose.
The Golden Rose by the Pope for being a defender of the Christian faith. And Luther responds to Henry VIII's...
It's a theological document he sent.
Yeah, it's surprising because I watch movies about King Henry VIII and I just feel like he's an overweight guy who hunts a lot, and yet he wrote this theological treatise against the Reformation, and Luther was pretty pointed in his response back to that. So Duke George yells at Frederick about Luther's writings, and so Frederick's having to become kind of a punching bag and accept this a little bit.
So Frederick worked with the council to come up with a response.
A bland response.
And it ended up being very bland, mostly because Frederick was able to leverage the fact that nobody really liked Henry VIII. Nobody wanted to give an English king more power or more authority.
Going back, Henry VIII was one of the candidates for election to Holy Roman Emperor.
Yeah.
Instead of Charles V, and there was a lot of maneuverings to make sure that didn't happen. So in Germany, they're not going to do a lot to celebrate or lift up or exalt Henry VIII or defend him against Luther. So even though Duke George is upset with Luther's response to Henry VIII's letter, no one in Germany...
The other princes
don't really want to side with Henry VIII in this.
Yeah.
So it makes it easier for Frederick to make a bland response. Frederick follows this up with a personal letter to the king apologizing for Luther's language. He's not going to apologize for what Luther wrote theologically, but he understands the diplomacy might not have been there.
And no promises to do anything about it. So
the Imperial Council is... like the Reichstag in 1522, also a bland failure.
Yeah, and so they decide, we're going to have another council. No.
Another Reichstag.
That's going to be in November.
So executive team can't figure it out. The whole voters' assembly met. Nothing really happened, but let's bring it back again. So November of 1522, the Reichstag's going to meet.
And Frederick, again, he's getting near the end of his life. He's going to die within 3 years.
So his absence from this Reichstag's not political. Physically, he couldn't attend.
He's getting sicker and sicker. His Philip von, and I don't know how, Filich, I don't know how to, Filich, I don't know how to pronounce his name, represented Frederick. And basically, there was a bunch of push to get Frederick and to enforce the Edict of Worms again.
Yeah, the papal nuncio is there. He's like, so the Pope's got his representative at the Reichstag, and the Pope's representative is telling the Reichstag, you guys have to enforce the Edict of Worms. And the princes are outraged. They don't want to do anything on the leash of the Pope because the Pope is ignoring their demand for reforms.
Right. And this all goes back to the previous episode, I think it was, where the 125 things that the princes want from the Pope that's independent of the whole Luther question.
So the Pope might be bundling them all together, but the princes see them as separate events. Right. Luther's one thing, and the princes' demands for reforms is another thing.
Right. And so long as the Pope isn't addressing their issues, they're not going to help him with Luther. Basically, by the end of 1522, the emperor and the Pope had given up on fighting with Frederick.
The Edict of Worms, kind of from 1522 onward,
it fizzled out.
It keeps Luther in Saxony. Like when there's the Reichstag in Augsburg, Luther's not able to go all the way. He has to go only as far as Coburg. But inside of Saxony, it's fine.
1522 was probably the most dangerous year for Frederick. This was when the Pope and the Emperor really had a concerted effort to force Frederick's hand. And
so they do everything they can to push Frederick's hand. And if Frederick moves with a wrong kind of step and misses the jab, he gets knocked out. But even though he's getting older, politically he's quick on his feet.
Yeah, he was able to manage through this. And really, it really came down to he had this carefully crafted appearance of impartiality. And even that was, he basically, it was his insistence on keeping the Old Castle Church aligned with the pre-Reformation. One of the things he did, and it was important, was to continue to have the Old Castle Church completely Roman Catholic. So all the old Roman Catholic stuff was still happening in the Old Catholic Church. And so, he protected the All Saints Foundation canons, which were basically monks, and they were sort of corrupt monks, well known around Wittenberg for getting drunk and having sex and all sorts of, but he protected them. And he protected within the Old Castle Church, the old pre-Reformation, didn't implement any sort of reforming activities in there. He did exactly what the Pope wanted to do within the little piece of land that he said, hey, this is my church. This is
the city church and St. Mary's City Church in Wittenberg, where Johannes Bugenhagen's the pastor, reforms are going to be able to happen there.
Yeah. So, and this was part of Frederick's strategy of saying, listen, I'm not part of this Reformation. I'm impartial. And if it was up to me, if I was a theologian, yeah, sure, I would be right with you, Pope. But, I'm no theologian. I'll just keep this stuff going on for me personally.
And talking about those canons, Luther did work to reform those communities. But even those communities that he wasn't able to reform, they kind of just die out. By 1525, Frederick's too old and weak to keep fighting over it. And those old All Saints Foundation canons, those monks that had been kind of protected, they also are gone.
Right. Luther further complicated Frederick's life.
Okay, so let's go back to 1523. We kind of showed the timeline of the canons petering out by 1525.
Right.
But 1523, what did Luther do that complicated Frederick's life?
So Frederick had, I'm going to say a relative, the Danish king Christian II. And Frederick knew Christian II was a bad person to have around.
So he had been the king since 1513, but he wasn't a good king.
He was a terrible leader.
ruler.
Absolutely. Finally, his subjects threatened his life. He finally escaped from into the.
He escapes from Denmark. He goes to the Netherlands.
Right, and then nobody liked him there, and so he ran out of the Netherlands, and he ended up going to Wittenberg, and he shows up and
he's a grifter.
He's a grifter, and he flattered Luther. Is what he did. Oh, it's so wonderful what you're doing. I'm totally on board with Christ alone, Scripture alone. Absolutely, yeah. I'm on board. And he portrayed himself as a Reformation-minded prince. And so Luther went to Frederick,
wrote a character reference.
Yeah,
and a letter that urged, and it's a public letter, and it urges Frederick to arrange a pension for Christian's wife. Ferdinand, and this pension is going to essentially be a public acceptance that Frederick's not only going to tolerate Christian in the Saxony lands, but is going to support him. But Frederick ignores the request.
Right. So Frederick was just the same way Frederick was able to, stonewall the Pope and stonewall the Emperor. Frederick stonewalled Luther.
But he did get disappointed that Luther was involved in something that wasn't theological, that Luther didn't understand. Why is it a bad idea to write a character reference for this guy?
And Frederick, exactly. Frederick was like, listen, you need to stay in your lane. And he never really did anything about it, but Luther, during this period, was a little full of himself,
He thought he could fix every problem.
Right.
And in 1524, Christian and his wife, they leave electoral Saxony to escape some creditors. So the problem kind of solves itself. But it reminds me of what a risk it is when pastors who are not experts in other things try to become experts in other things. And even today, we'll have pastors that will write on social media about topics they really don't know about. And quickly, they become revealed as the fool for what they've just said. And the danger is, yeah, all right, so Luther's a fool supporting Christian, but this has a risk of invalidating the very substantive things he's saying about the things he does know, theology, because people are like, oh, Luther, if you make a character reference about Christian and you were so wrong about that, are you wrong about these other things? And I think Frederick understands the risk to the Reformation.
Yeah.
And he's upset that Luther put at risk the Reformation by writing this letter in support of Christian.
Yeah. And Frederick is a master of managing. This is my lane. This is when
I'm not the theologian.
I'm not the, and
that's not pretend. It's really he knows his rule is a ruler.
Right. And he saw that as being powerful and important to keep in your lane, to maximize the power that you have. And he was very disappointed in Luther.
1524, Frederick's health is failing. He's mentally sharp, but it's harder for him to get around. Constant pain. He's got a kidney stone blocking his urinary tract, forcing him to rely on his brother John, his nephew John Frederick, to do more of the political leadership that Saxony needs.
So John Frederick, one of the first things that he got into here during this period is he went to go actually listen to Karlstadt. Listen
Müntzer.
to Müntzer. He went to
Allstadt.
Allstadt. There we go. Allstadt to hear Müntzer, and he didn't like what he heard. And so John,
he writes even, I am having a terrible time with the Satan of Allstadt. Kindliness right. and letters do not suffice. The sword, which is ordained of God to punish the evil, must be used with energy. So this is a moment of question. Christian nobility. What role do they have in silencing bad theologians?
Right. And this is a difficult question. In June 1524, the peasants started being unruly in the southern part of Germany. Frederick and his brother John decided to hear Müntzer to get a sense of Muntzer's thinking, so they called him to the Weimar to preach. Müntzer, being Müntzer, didn't hold back. He claimed that he had the authority of the Holy Spirit and threatened the monarchs with the wrath of God if they didn't do what he said. So this is, again, a pastor going outside of his lane. There's this, telling the authorities, I'm in charge of you, which is the same thing the Pope was doing. This is sort of a a Reformation version or a Protestant version of the popes. I have authority over over secular authorities. You know.
Yeah, is the utopia going to look like Müntzer's idea that the peasants revolt and everyone listens to me because I'm divinely ordained to not only speak theology but to speak everything?
Yeah, yeah. So,
but Müntzer, he knows his sermon pushed the edge, so
somehow I'm sure they let him know.
He read the room.
He read the room.
He left town. He disappeared for a while. He did finally show up in the free city of Mulhausen, which had no sovereign. There existed in Europe these free cities that had certain independences, and Mulhausen was one of those. So Müntzer is not in the territory of Saxony. Frederick really couldn't do much about it. He decided to spend the last part of his summer at his hunting palace in Lachau. He left briefly in October. He returned in December. He never really left his hunting palace again. He's going to make it through the winter and spring of early 1525. His health it's deteriorating.
So he's still sharp right until the end.
Writing letters, communicating.
He's not sleeping. He's in so much pain. But he's in the middle of all this. The Peasants' Rebellion starts. And so that's Müntzer and others. Müntzer was not, he was the theological we'll say the backing for the Peasants' Rebellion. But the Peasants' Rebellion sort of popped up independent.
It had an anarchist chaos to it.
Yeah.
That to say that Müntzer is the leader is to give him too much credit, and also describes the Peasants' Revolt as if it was nobly led.
Right, and it was not. It was basically just a mob, and they would find somebody who was wealthy, or they'd find somebody who was a prince, or they'd find somebody who was a knight, and they'd jump him and kill him. And they killed them in the most horrific ways.
They finally did develop a certain amount of what were called the 12 Articles. These were their demands. If you meet our demands, we'll be nice again.
What happened was, I think there were some nobles, sort of like Frederick, who they looked at what the peasants were going through. They said, listen, yes, you do have genuine issues. And they tried to bring order to the Peasants' Revolt. And they put out these 12 articles, and the 12 articles actually, well, if you read through the 12 articles, check out Wikipedia, they're very close. A lot of the things we take for granted are there. They're reasonable.
They're coming at the edge of a sword.
They're coming at exactly.
Give us these things, or we start to kidnap more people.
Right. And Frederick's not in any shape to manage this one. So anyway, the Peasants' War starts up, and they are crushed by the nobles.
It ended fairly quickly. Frederick was asking for negotiations in good faith. The other sovereigns were only really pretending to negotiate when they maneuvered their military into position. And when the time was right, they sprung the trap. They slaughtered the country folk. They executed all the leaders. It was a remarkably violent and excessive response to the Peasants' Revolt.
Yeah. So on May 5th, 1525, Frederick knows he doesn't have much time. He called his children and his servants to him to say goodbye, dismissed them all to make one final confession to his priest. After that, he called all his servants back. He felt bad about the times he had been short-tempered with them, which couldn't have been very often, but there it was. He did feel bad about it. And a quote from him is, "Dear little children, I ask you, for God's sake, where I would have made you angry, we princes burden the poor people in all ways, and that is not good." So he asked for forgiveness from all the people that worked for him.
So Sebastian's his son, but not in a noble way. He's not going to be able to inherit the electoral Saxony. That's going to go to his brother John, and then it'll go to John's son, John Frederick. But so Sebastian is asked, "Son, what do you have here?" Frederick asked Sebastian, "What do you have here?" And Sebastian answered, "Spalatin sent me something to read to you."
And that was the consolation from God's word. Frederick said, "Hey, listen, bring me my eyeglasses. I'll read it myself." He read God's word, called his secretary and Spalatin to record his third and final will. And in this final version of his will, he seemed most concerned about taking care of his wife and his children. After the will was complete, Spalatin asked him, "My master, does the gracious elector have any burdens?" And Frederick said, "Nothing but the pain." And those were his last words.
Now, we've been referring him to Frederick. Sometimes we refer to him as Frederick the Wise. That title, the Wise, well-earned, but it doesn't come till many years later. Immediately after his death, very few people had good things to say about him. They thought he was a part of the instrument of division and schism between Rome and Europe.
Of course, the Roman Catholic Church still doesn't have a whole lot of good things to say about Frederick the Wise. But what was really surprising to me was to hear some of the things Luther had to say about him.
Yeah, the Castle Church, which Mike had mentioned, was kept kind of pristine from old ways. Wasn't reformed, and it is the Castle Church where the 95 Theses were posted. The Castle Church operated as the place where university students at Wittenberg were expected to worship, and it was kept kind of old school.
Yeah.
Inside of Wittenberg, there was also the city church, St. Mary's, and that's where kind of everyone else in town was supposed to go to. And so...
So Luther had several complaints. First was the Catholic Church. The second complaint was he said that Frederick built too much, that he built too much, and that the money should have gone to the poor or something like this.
There's a lot of great castles and houses in Saxony you can visit.
Yeah, and then
he did build a lot.
Yeah, and he said, our previous writings were that he saw building buildings as basically a works program, as something to keep as a way for him to get more money into the hands of the peasants.
He didn't quite have a home, like one city that was always his home. So he would kind of give opportunity for many cities in Saxony to experience the wealth of the arrival of the noble, which would bring a lot of work, and then he'd go to another place and another place. So,
and he'd build something, and he'd show up, and he'd spend a lot of money there, and he'd go someplace else, and he'd spend a lot of money. So there was a reason he did this, but again, this is Luther getting out of his lane and complaining about something he didn't know a whole lot about. Later in his life, Luther he softened on Frederick, and he later stated, "It is a great gift to have a good and wise prince such as Elector Frederick, who was truly the father of his country. He governed excellently." So even Luther softened up over the course of the years later. Frederick continues to be, I'll say, a controversial figure. The Catholic Church still, if you get a Catholic historian, they'll have a lot of bad things to say about Frederick. Of course, Luther.
He was a person that was able to utilize imperial ecclesiastical power in order to protect Luther, to slow processes down. And in a way, I appreciate it because I think it does demonstrate there's a space for politics.
Yeah.
It's not either theology or the sword.
Yeah.
One or the other. There's some space in the middle for, if we can create some time for conversation.
Yeah.
I mean, this even goes back to a topic that we didn't spend much time on. But when a priest decided to get married in Kemberg, Frederick caused enough delay that eventually the issue just kind of died down. The priest was able to continue to serve in the parish he was at. He got married. And Frederick never spoke for or against it. He just worked in such a way that the man could be married and serve.
One of the things that impressed me was that I never realized that Frederick was not well thought of across the board.
Because he's the wise, Frederick the Wise.
Both sides hated him. Both sides were frustrated with him. Both sides were angry with him. And it wasn't until decades later that people started to soften toward him. Maybe 10, 15, 20 years later that the general Reformation view of Frederick really began to soften.
So Frederick the Wise, and then you're going to get John the Steadfast.
Yeah.
And that's kind of a contrast between the two of them. Third Camp of Scholars, kind of probably more operational now, understands Frederick as a wise Christian prince, multi-leveled, pragmatic sovereign, singularly honest with conviction, and yet always knowing what his duty was versus someone else's duty. So this finishes our 8-part series on Frederick the Wise, and we hope you've enjoyed it a great deal. We've both, I think, enjoyed kind of seeing the side of the Reformation that isn't just theological tracts and treatises.
Yeah, I really enjoyed getting into the weeds on Frederick. That was something that, to understand the world of medieval Saxony,
That's where the humanity of history happens, inside
Yeah.
the details.
and to be able to spend some time and really, really think about the world that Luther lived in, not from a theological standpoint, which is so much of the time I've studied Luther, I only look at the theology, whether it's the Luther's theology or the Catholic theology of the time. To be able to see the politics that he was living in is a whole different perspective. And I personally enjoyed this. So thanks for suggesting it there, Evan. This was great. Cheers.
Cheers.